you had around 90% of the population that was living outside of non-metros or big cities for the first time being connected. Probably over 1 billion people had the opportunity to get connected, to be part of the national discourse. It felt that this was the right moment, that this was a watershed moment in Indian society.
Welcome to the content category. I'm super excited to be here with Shalabh. He's the CEO of NEWJ. Shalabh, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. This is awesome.
Absolutely. Why are we having this conversation? We looked at well over 1,000 companies in the content category, the overarching category that has a tremendous amount of companies that are creating any form of content. But one of the startups that really stood out to us was NEWJ, especially within the political and news space. Their approach to not only creating content, but content distribution is something that how they're initiated and started is different from, I think, what we've seen anyone else, especially within the news and political category. And it's exciting to see the growth that they've made so far, and the content that they've created so far is absolutely impressive. And their approach, I think, is definitely for this particular category in content creation is probably on the front of the trend compared to most news media companies. So it's fantastic to have you part of this conversation. Before we jump even into the questions about NEWJ, you have provided us with a great video that gives a brief overview of who is NEWJ. And then I think after that, we'll just dive into questions. Sounds good?
Yeah, perfect. Great.
Awesome video. I really appreciate it. Thanks for sharing that. One of the things I'm just curious about, is there a backstory behind NEWJ? Why you started this company?
So I've been away from India since 2007. I did my undergrad in Toronto, worked there for a bit, and then I was in New York for 3.5 years. And I'd been, of course, I'd known India, and I grew up here. But with the 4G coming into India and Jio making data really cheap, what you had in India happening was that you had around 90% of the population that was living outside of non-metros or big cities for the first time being connected. Because otherwise, if you're in the middle of nowhere or if you're in a small village, chances were that you were pretty much asked twice in 5 years, one for state elections and one for national elections, to be part of the national discourse. But for the first time, essentially an entire population, which is probably over 1 billion people, had the opportunity to get connected, to be part of the national discourse, to be part of mainstream conversation. And for me, that was a huge thing, because storytelling to me is the foremost way of telling history, telling news, because all of these content categories or all genres essentially fall under storytelling. And India, having the history that it does and being a relatively new democracy for 70 years, it felt that this was the right moment, that this was a watershed moment in Indian society. And we wanted to make sure, which is why our name NEWJ, because Indian languages typically don't have the sound that you associate with a Z or a Z, as you say in States, but they would typically replace that with a J. So when you go to sort of urban, rural India, you go to villages or small towns, they will always say NEWJ, even when they're trying to say news. So that's where our name comes from. And our focus has always been on looking at non-metro, looking at non-urban centers to really focus on the population that was essentially finding the internet for the first time, basically finding the world for the first time. Because most of these individuals had never left their villages, had never left their rural centers. So we wanted to be there when they actually see the world. And we wanted to make sure that we spoke to them in the language they best understood. So we could be the window into this entire world of the internet and the rest of the world. So we could help them get along and get them to speed as quickly.
That's absolutely incredible, knowing the backstory and especially knowing India, a place that's absolutely massive. And I suppose as the internet penetration continues to grow, seeing how a lot of new readers come online and how that is not only big, it's a huge opportunity to tell a story to a lot of people. But your approach to doing this is what I think is really unique compared to most news, media, any type of content, because you focus on really distributing video, short form video content almost exclusively through social networks. I'm just curious, why did you start with this? Why was this your route to share your stories that you wanted to create with the population across India?
I think there were 2 or 3 aspects to it. First and foremost being that we wanted to be in video because, again, India's population being the way it is, chances were that you had more people who were visually able to communicate rather than people who were able to read. Of course, there's a literacy, but also the fact that the newer generation probably does not want to read that much, and especially in rural India. So first and foremost, it had to be a video-centric focus. The second was that I think I'd worked in New York, I'd worked in Now This, so I'd seen the socially distributed model work. The question was whether it was going to work in India, but because of the recent sort of penetration and boom in Indian data and people getting access to cheap smartphones and having cheap data meant that everyone was getting on social platforms. Now, I genuinely believe in today's day and age that if you're going to start a website or if you're going to start an app, you have to be you have to have that unique proposition that nobody else can provide. So we do not want to focus 30 to 40% of our business managing a website or managing an app when it essentially creates additional steps for your viewers to come and see you. Because as soon as you create an app, your competitors suddenly become Facebook and YouTube and Instagram. We didn't want to compete with them yet. So the idea was to essentially go where the audiences already were, where they were most comfortable. And again, these are people who, it's the first time, right? They haven't grown up with seeing the dial-up modem. They haven't seen computers yet. They've probably seen them in some film or some shows. We're talking about households that probably 3 or 4 households together have a TV. But right now they've just got this cheap smartphone, this very cost-effective smartphone, and they've got the lowest data rates in the world. So they have this thing in front of them, and they are obviously going to go where the biggest community is. So to us, it was the distributed model was essentially home delivery versus takeout. If in today's day and age, especially in India, people like things delivered to them, there has to be that uniqueness and there has to be that comfort. So it made sense to be where people already were, and social platforms were a great way to connect with them. And we just wanted to focus on our storytelling to begin with. So we did not want to get sidetracked with managing a website, seeing all the other consumer acquisition and trying people to get to download those apps. So we wanted to focus just on stories. And it seemed the best way and most efficient way and the effective way was going to be through social distribution, because people in India were already there. And that's why we wanted to get to them as quickly as possible.
You know, it's really interesting. You talk about having seen companies like Now This and looking at the ecosystem, especially when you look at Group 9 Media and a couple other players that kind of taken that social approach. It tends to be entertainment content.
Yeah.
I don't really see anybody touch news content in this format. And the fact that you've taken that and really took it on in a big way and continue to find success and viewership in that model I think it's really interesting. really awesome. And I agree 100%. It's a fantastic way to communicate stories, especially with a pretty broad audience. And with that, I'm curious because I'm just curious about how you create content. What is this process of creating content for you? Now, I know video is probably harder to work with as a medium, not only to create, edit, and publish, but also how do you create content at scale? Because social media platforms, I'm sure, are much more demanding of content than maybe other mediums.
I mean, in the past 2 years, we started with probably getting a few stories out every day. At the moment, we published over 400 unique pieces of content every week. And we have around over 90 social media channels across like almost 14 different social platforms that we're publishing. And we publish in 9 languages now. So in addition to Hindi and English, you've got 7 other regional languages and 3 other getting added to the portfolio within the next month. So I think the way to go about social video for us has been, of course, there's the traditional way of going out to shoot. But in a country, especially in India, where smartphones we're the largest or going to be the largest smartphone consumption sort of country in the world, everyone's a reporter. Everyone can make video. It's just trying to get to them and understanding how best to get to them. Either they're uploading it through their social channels. And I believe that right now we're looking at content from a distribution point of view, which is how we've always looked at content. But I think it's missing something, which is to really start looking at each piece of content individually and take distribution out. So that was the idea here, that a single individual might not be able to get a viral video because they just don't have the distribution network. It's just going to stay in that silo and never come out. But if we are able to tap into that individual, tap into that content with our wider distribution network, we can actually get that video to reach its potential. So it's always been we've got a reporter program, which is basically, we have around 3,000 signups in the first time we started. Of course, we started right before the pandemic, so that was a challenge. But the idea was to essentially look at college individuals, university students, and ask them to send us content. And if we pick this story, we're able to have a freelance contract with them. And they get paid to create content, which they're doing either way. And universities typically are the hub of information in any city. Chances are, if something's happened in a city, the first place that it's going to really get going is going to be the university. Of course, going to people's personal social accounts, asking them if they'd be okay with sharing that piece of content. And usually people are because everyone wants to have their content sort of featured. So for us, it was a no-brainer. And of course, we have our own IPs that we create with our studio team, and looking at branded content and just regular shows that we do. But the focus was always to give people a platform where they can talk about what they want and where they can get amplified. Because again, it's a market that's relatively new. It's still evolving and maturing. And our focus from day one has been to provide a place where India's emerging markets, our new sort of internet users, can really come and find what exactly all of this is about and who they're about. So we wanted it to be a two-way communication. And for us, that meant that we needed to go out to people and who are our audiences and get their stories.
I think it's a fantastic approach, and really branching out a lot of different ways in which you can aggregate content and find those right pieces that would be fit for your audience, and structuring it in a great way and distributing it through your channels. I'm curious, as a content creator, but then also as almost like a news and political brand, how do you balance between quality and quantity?
I'll divide quantity versus quality into 2 separate areas. One being the quality or the quantity of the content itself, and the aesthetic aspect to it, because I think they both play an equally important role in especially video. How your video feels and looks as opposed to what your video is saying. I think in the former, unfortunately, creativity and quality has no upper ceiling. You can take 20 years to build a film and an avatar pops out. So that's your benchmark, right? Which meant that we first wanted to focus on quantity and then slowly start checking how we could increase quality and how that affected quantity. Now, in terms of the content itself, I think that's been a criticism of news media that we're so focused on negative emotions that we're just not able to really grasp the reality of what our viewers want. And it's been that way because as an industry, we've never really had a two-way communication street. Our communication has always been one way. Whether it's newspapers, you never really knew if your article was being read. You just knew the newspaper was being sold. Then television came along and you got to know different slots when you had viewers, but you never really know how they were feeling. Like there were studies and all of those, but there were sample studies. You never really know how every one of your users felt. And I realized that, yes, extremely negative content does evoke a lot of response, but so does extremely positive too. And I think a criticism, and a valid criticism of our profession, has been that we seldom really look at the really positive aspects to it. So for us, it's a balance between the two, that we would rather run a really positive story than run a really negative one, or just run both of them. The point is that for us, it's the amplification of individuals and groups within India who are coming in, who are experiencing the internet, and through the internet, the world for the first time. And chances are they've already heard everything that's going wrong. India is a big country, and every country has a lot of problems and challenges. India is no exception. But that's all we talk about. Whether I think even in the United States, I feel like we as an industry, we're so hell bent upon looking at everything from a lens of criticism, that we sometimes forget that reality for everyone else who's not us is very different. It's always a shade of gray. Nothing is ever black and white. So for us, it's very important to make sure that we are highlighting the good things that are happening, and especially individual or small groups who are doing amazing things, because how else do you motivate a country of 1 billion people, especially those who are coming on the internet for the first time? How do you really get them to look at themselves in a way where they can feel that everything that they've done, they haven't missed out? Just because they weren't here does not mean that their existence up until now has been futile. So it's very important to show the small things. And I think sometimes through those small things or those small stories, you actually realize that a lot of what at least rural India has been following is now coming up as valid signs. Eating early, having a balanced routine. These are things that if you go into a village in India is going to be the way of life, but they've never known how to defend that. Up until now, they just assumed that because they were living in a village, that's what they were, and people who were living in cities had a great lifestyle. But now we wanted to let them know that, you know what, now science has caught up to your way of living, and it believes it's the best way to go. So next time you meet someone who you feel has a better lifestyle, tell them that it's not. So for us, those are the stories that really matter, because everything else is being covered. If something huge has happened, chances are that we're not going to be the first ones, and we don't want to be the first ones. We want to be the ones who actually tell the story in the best way that our audiences understand it, in the language they understand it, and in the way they want to hear it.
It definitely makes sense. And I think that's a fantastic approach overall. Especially for you guys, for the content that you're creating and your approach to creating content, distributing it. I'm just curious, for you, is content creation more of an art form? And I know this is news content, so it's hard to take it in a certain context, but for you, is it more of an art form, or is it more of a data-driven decision-making process?
So we've incorporated data from day one. We wanted to make sure, because it's a market that nobody really understands, so we didn't want our assumptions to come in the way of understanding our audiences. Again, this is a market that's never been looked at in the way that we wanted to look at it. So we wanted data to drive a lot of our decision-making. I think that's another thing that the creative industry in general, and I'm not just talking about news, because again, news probably does not give you the sort of scope for creativity that sort of non-news content does. It's the idea that creating content is 100% creative endeavor. I think 30%, 40% might be creative, but the rest of it can be standardized based on what our best practice is. The best example I can give is, what color should the text be on screen? Now, this is why Coke is red. This is why brands have the colors that they do, because there are certain ways to figure that out. Now, I don't think that's a decision that an editor should be making, a video editor should be making, because on what they feel is the best color to use on text. So for us, and from an editorial point as well, I think if you're looking at an audience that has never been looked at, you have to take into account their preferences, because choices for everyone are so vast now that you have to co-opt people into a conversation, into believing and into really following you, which means that you have to start talking about things that they feel important. Whether you feel them important is besides the point. And I think that's what's happening across the globe as well. If you look at most news networks, sometimes when you look at ratings on how journalists are viewed these days, I don't think anybody's sitting in their house thinking, oh, journalists are evil. I think there's just a huge divide in what journalists consider important as to what people who are non-journalists consider important. So while you might be on the same wavelength with people in your city and other cities, people outside of cities have a very different lifestyle. They have a very different reality. And I think that gets missed when you're in a newsroom for, say, either in Mumbai or in New York. And I think that's why that's something that only data can give you, unless you want to go door to door and find. But when you look at a lot of your audiences, and a lot of them are coming from similar backgrounds, but are very different, especially in a country like India, where you've got so many languages, so many different sort of cultural nuances from one region to another. You do have to look at our broader trends that, again, can only be seen through data when you have a lot of data to look at what exactly are the conversations that they're interested on, what are the things that they would love to talk about. And our decision making has been data driven, at least not from each story perspective, but from broad content category perspective, at least. Yeah.
No, it definitely makes sense. And especially for you to understand really, when you talked about earlier, how you create stories that really engage with the audience in the ways that they understand, especially for a market like India that's very complex, very large, lots of different languages. It really does make sense why you take a much more data-driven approach, especially for content.
Yeah.
But one of the big weird things that's happening, especially this last couple of years, and I'd love to get your feedback on this, it feels like one, in the content space, especially for news and politics, there's been a lot of heavy criticism, especially towards media outlets. There's been this, maybe this might be catered more toward the US, but polarization or attacks on media, and this has probably gone on forever. Generally, there might be like for especially the more traditional media companies, the sentiment of distrust. And so there's that aspect. On the other flip side, there's also this weird relationship between news and politics, especially on other platforms and social networks, and managing either political figures on social networks or managing the conversations of types of content on networks. I'm just curious, I know that's a boatload, but as a company that's especially creating political and news content solely for social networks, how do you navigate this craziness that's going on, I think, that's happening in the world and all these different complexities, especially for your category?
I think, again, I think as an industry, this is something that we have to own up to as journalists. Politics is the lowest hanging fruit, right? It's the lowest hanging fruit. It's the thing that everyone wants to talk about. It's a thing that everyone has an opinion on. And to be honest, on a daily basis, it's not really adding that much value. If you think about it, it's a great soap opera happening in front of your eyes, but daily political updates don't really do that much. If one politician said something to the other, yeah, it's going to have an impact on what they go eventually. But on you daily, nothing. What Pelosi said to Cruz on a daily basis does not matter. It's just banter, right? They're just having a conversation. Now, the problem is, when we think about news, we only think about politics. And what we've done is that we've stayed away from political news. Political news is a part of our storytelling, is part of our content and news portfolio. There's a lot of other news that has nothing to do with partisanship. That can absolutely be something as small as whether the street in front of your house is proper or not. No politician cares about it. There's no political thing there. but it is news, at least for the person whose house it is. So for us, we've always we made sure we made a very conscious decision to not just jump into politics to begin with. Because again, every journalist wants to be a political reporter. Great, such a surprise because nobody else wants to do that. But everyone does. It's the lowest hanging fruit. And I think that's where a lot of the polarization that you're saying, and it's not just a United States phenomenon, it's happening everywhere across the world. It might be a different shade in the United States, but I think that's where we are as a race, as a species now, because communication has never been this fast and they've never been this easy in as long as we've lived on this planet. And I think for me and for NEWJ, it's very important to keep politics as one content area. Politics is not all news. There's a lot of news that is besides politics that can be talked about. And we just try and make sure that we treat politics as one part of it and not really get sucked into all of it.
No, it absolutely makes sense. And having that diversity of being able to balance, I think, is a great component of your content, and also not getting sucked into the just politics trap, even though it can be a little bit enticing, it seems. But I also want to dig a little bit deeper. It seems like there's been weird relationships also with just news content with social platforms. I know there's been a recent issue between Facebook and Australian news outlets. Yeah. And I'm sure India has different, the Indian government or has probably different issues that arise between news and social media platforms. As a company that relies on social platforms, is this something that worries you or concerns you in the future at all?
So India actually only yesterday, the Indian Ministry of Law, I think, passed. They're in the process of creating a regulation that forces social media platforms to be more responsive to both government as well as individuals in the society. Because I do agree that social media platforms cannot be super world powers. They have to abide within the laws of the land. And specifically in India, at the end of the day, let's take an example for Twitter. Twitter's code of conduct cannot supersede India's constitution. So if Indian constitution or if the Indian government, by the power vested in the constitution, deems me a journalist, then Twitter cannot say that I'm not a journalist and what I say is not accepted. And that's a problem with the internet either way, because it's so difficult to govern, and the idea of sovereignty itself, because no government would like to, if people in any country are spending 3 to 4 hours on social media, no government would want to cede sovereignty for 3 to 4 hours on their individuals. I don't think we'd want that as people electing governments either. That for 3 to 4 hours, our government just have no say. At the end of the day, these are legal representatives. They are the ones that we're voting in power. I think it's important as a publisher, I understand. And at the end of the day, I think my concerns come from that as a publisher, I have no way to communicate my grievances. If I work within a constitution, within a legal framework, then I need to have ways to be able to seek redressal, to say that, you know what, I do not agree that this particular decision was right, or if you decided to shadow ban me, then I don't know why that is. I would like there to be a person who justifies why that is. And I think social media companies and platforms will have to take that into cognizance, and I think they already are. I think they realize that at some point that they would have to figure out how do you address significant challenges that come with so many people being so interconnected, and you having a lever that allows for all of this to be controlled and not. And I remember that social experiments Facebook ran in a country just to see if they could allow for subliminal cues to get you to vote. Now, whether that's a good thing or not, the point is nobody really agreed to it. So I think there has to be a balance, and I think we've tilted too much towards one end, which is I think social media companies will need to start looking either that, or there needs to be more choices. And I think that's where everyone really feels concerned, is that the choices are very few. And I think as we evolve, and again, social media is a very young thing. We're at its infancy. The internet itself is at its infancy. If you think about it, it's just been 20 years and 10 years for mainstreaming of it. So we're just in the beginning where we're still trying to figure out what safety equipment to wear. Do we need to wear gloves or not? So I think in the next 5-10 years, we'll get to a point where we're more comfortable. Not to mention kids who've grown up with the internet, their ability to process information is way faster than ours will ever be. So I feel like this might be a problem that our generation feels that went from a dial-up modem to 5G within one lifetime. I think kids who are digitally native are gonna have a different way they look at it because they've just been surrounded by it since they were young.
No, I agree 100%. I feel like it's, especially given that we're just shaking through the system and getting realizing the issues and slowly molding it to, I think, a tool that would make sense for everybody and all stakeholders and regardless of the region that you're in. I'm curious, you take an approach for the news category, doing short video content, primarily on social media platforms. I mean, what is your business model?
I think there in a 100-year history of content, and I'm using that term loosely, when newspapers first started, we've only been able to figure out two ways to monetize. One is through advertisers, the other is through consumers. And it's weird to think about it because, yeah, it's been 100 years and we haven't figured out any other way. For us, it's the former. We haven't really figured out how to monetize users, and we don't want to. But the idea is to use branded content to look at brands, but not to, because I also believe that advertising has changed in social media. The ads that you see on TV are not meant for digital and definitely are not meant for social, because social audiences are slightly more acute in their understanding of what is an ad and what is not. And I think the best example of that is the skip intro button on Netflix. You're willing to binge watch something for 10 hours straight. We refuse to watch 15 seconds of that show reel. That's the population we're talking about. That's who we are now. So your ad that you wanted that starts with your logo and ends with your logo and talks about your logo in between doesn't work. Nobody's going to listen to it. Nobody's going to look at it. It's not going to have that. And I think brands eventually have to, and that's what we're doing, especially in a market like India, is we're really trying to get some of the less well-known brands, get them comfortable with the idea of social, because just the way it's a great opportunity for individuals to really make a not name for themselves, but to really be heard, which was otherwise impossible without social media. Same holds true for brands. It is a great opportunity for brands, for companies who believe that they missed the television advertising boat, or they missed the digital sort of static screensaver boat. It is time for them to show how unique they are by really engaging with the audience, by going ahead and doing something bold. And I think eventually brands will have to look at that creating good content is the only sure shot way of getting their brand to be different and to be in the user's mind the way they want it to be. So I think advertising and marketing and I think they have been quick to adopt to it. I wouldn't say that all brands are, because I still believe that a lot of companies who are smaller still don't know if this is something for them, because you have the top 100 brands spending a lot, but the next 100 don't know what to do. So I think industries in general, probably until the pandemic came, pharmaceutical companies probably didn't know what to do with social, but now they're understanding there can be a play here. There is a way to get ourselves out there in a meaningful way. So I think just the way it happened with individuals, where you had influencers who suddenly popped out, no one knew them, and they became big. I think it's a great opportunity for brands who up until now have been slightly hesitant in understanding what this is, or just trying to figure out where they fit in, for them really to jump out of the clutter and really engage with their consumers, with their users in a meaningful way. And I think we're just here to find the best way that we can do that for them. So yeah, to your question, it's essentially the same advertising model still.
Sure. And you work directly actually with these brands and integrate, either you create content for them and put that within your videos, or part of the videos that you create?
So typically we want to create a campaign for them on what we believe would be a campaign around a particular event or around a particular time frame, or if they've got a product launch. Or what I prefer is just to let people know about the brand story itself. Especially if you look at some of the bigger companies, they have a beautiful story that most people haven't heard. So the idea, especially in a country like India, where storytelling up until now has been quite limited, the idea is to look at some of these unique stories, because chances are that most of these people who've created these brands came from nothing. And in a country where you have, out of 1.3 billion, over 50% of your population below the age of 24, you need stories to inspire. You need old entrepreneurs to really motivate younger generations to really try and be different and to innovate and to experiment. I think it's just an idea. It's just trying to figure out how you bring these stories along and how do you create a meaningful conversation. Because if you're not able to really create a meaningful conversation, then your users are just going to either swipe up, swipe down, or just go to a different platform. And I think, or look at a different publisher. So it's important for us to look at advertising in a different way too. For instance, I think ad agencies, I don't really know what they're doing anymore or why they exist. Because at one point they were the ones who were essentially they were analyzing data, right? Because this data nobody could understand, and they had their firms and their own studies done. But now publishers and advertisers get data directly from social platforms. So if you've got somebody who can crunch numbers, then you have that. But to me, like I'm still trying to figure out what happens to ad agencies. In 10 years, I don't know.
What's interesting though is especially how you create content and the format in which you engage with your users, especially over these short form videos. But then you're also on platforms that are absolutely massive and majority where users are at today. And having a team that can create a nice crafted message and story that represents the brand in a way that they would feel comfortable with. I think it's a fantastic partnership for a lot of brands, especially for a user base that's coming online, that's reading a lot of these stories for the first time for some of them. And the reach that you have in a lot of different regions is fantastic. But I got a couple more questions here for you. I'm just curious because we've gone through almost over a year's worth of a pandemic. And I'm just curious, has the pandemic at all affected your company or your industry?
I would say that I think every publisher in the world probably saw a spike as soon as the pandemic hit. But I do believe that as it has gone on and as it has progressed, people have consumed more content than they would have in their lifetime, probably. I know my parents started watching Netflix, which was strange, considering they never really switched from TV. But one day they asked for my Netflix and my Amazon and my Hotstar account. I was like, okay. And my dad went through this phase that I went through a few years ago. We were just so into documentaries. He's like, oh, have you watched this? I was like, yeah, it was great. He's like, yeah, so good. I think people did have a lot of time, and I think they did consume a lot of content. But I also believe that it became a challenge towards the second half of 2020, because for publishers, there just wasn't enough happening to think about stories. You didn't have the usual stuff that happens when you're crossing a street, right? So if people are not crossing the street, there aren't that many stories happening on the street. So I at least for us, at one point, we were looking at what do we do now? Because people have done everything. They've done all the Zoom parties and they've done all the virtual hangouts that they could within the first 2 months. And I was worried about that because I felt like everyone needed to pace themselves. But everyone thought this is going to be a month thing or 2 months tops. So I think we overdid it in the first couple of months, and then we didn't have anything else to do. But as a publisher, I think it forced us to be more creative. It forced news to be more creative. And I think that's where, to me, the most creative element has come out, is because news typically does not allow you a lot of creativity because you're always just trying to catch up to the news cycle. But when the news cycle isn't that strong, not for a day, for 2 days, but for weeks, because there just isn't, everything is in lockdown, and India had a very strict lockdown, then how do you really think about, because you can't stop publishing. So I think it forced us to be slightly uncomfortable, which is great because I think growth only happens when you're slightly uncomfortable. It allowed us to really have to think about what are we going to create, what kind of stories we want to tell, What are the important news stories that people want to hear, and how do we get them to listen to it? After the first 3 months, nobody wanted to hear the word coronavirus, but that was the time that was the most important. So how do you really create that? And for us, I think we were lucky because we create videos. So there's an infinite possibility realm for us. And I think we did well. And I think there was, within the industry itself, there was a huge spike when the coronavirus came along. But I think I'm not sure if the same consumption patterns are going to stick around when people start to socialize in person. But I'm really interested to see what parts of these consumption trends are going to be here to stay, and which are the ones that we really are going to be related just purely to the lockdown phenomenon.
Well, Shalabh, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate your time. Before we close out, I actually had one more question. I think news is already the future of news. I do think that. You guys, I think, are at the forefront of both the content approach and distribution. But I'm just curious, what do you think is the future of news content creation or distribution, or just in general? And what do you see that most people don't?
I think I'll take that question more from a journalist perspective, and I don't think I can speak for the industry or the profession, but if they're here listening to me, and here are my 2 cents. I think because we had a few monopolies that nobody else enjoyed, which was mass communication. Nobody else could communicate with the wider public the way we could. We had the infrastructure for breaking stories, and I feel like both of these have been taken away from us. We can break a story every now and then, but chances are somebody's breaking the story on Twitter and then we're just following it up. Everyone has a big megaphone, so we don't own mass communication anymore, which means I think journalists themselves will need to start looking at what really makes them unique and what is their true value addition. I think a lot of media is still playing catch up, and I think we have to not think about 2022, 2023, but we need to think about 2035. Who are we going to be in 2035? What are we going to be adding? And start working towards that. Because otherwise we're always going to catch up. And the fact is that as an industry, we're fighting against all of our consumers because they're all potential individuals who can take away what we're doing. And they have the ability to, and they should. I don't think that they shouldn't have the ability to. So I think as an organization, as an industry, we really need to understand what is our value addition. It used to be that we were able to communicate with everyone, which was great, but it does not exist anymore. It used to be that we were the first ones to know. That's not true anymore either. So what exactly are we bringing? Are we creating as value to the society? Think about it, and then don't think that it's going to be a 2025 goal. It has to be a 2035 goal. What are we going to do in 2030? What are we going to be doing in 2035? And start working towards that today. Because I don't know how else to. And for us, I think that's the question that we keep asking ourselves. What are we going to be in 2035? So yeah, look ahead and get to the next curve before anybody else does.
No, I think it's a really interesting perspective, seeing how media being decentralized and it's knowing. I like that you put it in the two perspective. It's hard to be a mass. There's no mass communication. It's also it's almost impossible to have breaking stories, especially in the age of social networks. But really thinking about, as a journalist, how do you carve out that niche, but also create that value for the ecosystem? And I do think that what you guys are doing today at NEWJ is, I think you've run that path, and I think you guys are doing some incredible things, and especially with the ways that you engage your audience, it's really unique. So with that, Shalabh, I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. Before I close out, was there anything else that you wanted to share, announce, or ask of the audience?
No, but thank you so much for giving me this time. I know I'm the one speaking here, but I do think that all of this is because we have a great team at NEWJ here. And I think India just is at a place where there are just so many possibilities. And we like to look at challenges as opportunities, especially the fact that India has so many different languages. To us, that's a new market, that's a new way of storytelling. Every language has its own nuances that allows for that creativity. So I think journalists and media, I think we just need to be a little more okay with being uncomfortable, and really need to start thinking about what are we bringing. we're not indispensable. I think that's been proven. We would like to be indispensable, and I do believe that journalists and media have a role to play in the society. We just need to figure it out because it isn't figured out. And I think rather than trying to focus on how to be ahead of this herd or win this race, I think it's more important to look at the larger picture and figure out where do we want to go, because I'm super excited to see the kind of media organizations that are going to exist in 2035. And I feel like it's going to blow our minds, and I'm super excited. Some of it might be really strange, but I think that's the path we're all on. So I think it's going to be great. I'm super excited for this, and thank you so much for this time again.
Absolutely. Of course. And again, for the audience, why we had this conversation, we looked at well over 1,000 companies in the content category, and the company that really stood out to us was NEWJ. Their approach to not only content creation, but their method of distributing content, I think, is at the forefront, especially within this news and political category. I don't think there's any other startup that has and it's come out of the gate with this approach, especially for this content type. And it's fantastic, not only what you built, but also your approach and building out what you talked about in the very beginning. Having that short form video really allows you to create a storyline that you wouldn't be able to do in any other content format and engage with a huge audience, a complex audience, an audience that has multiple languages, and an audience that's coming online very fast for some of them for the first time, and then being able to engage with content that's important, that's powerful, but also is something in a way that you're not going to see anywhere else. And whether it's traditional format or other digital formats, I think your guys' approach is really impressive, and the work that you've done is super impressive. And I know that 2035 NEWJ is going to be the next biggest news conglomerate and media conglomerate in the world. So again, I really appreciate taking the time, Shalabh, and thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much, Kyle.